Welcome to the City of Decatur's Anti-Racism Speaker Series. Tim Wise is the fourth of four speakers to join us in conversation this fall as we work to become an anti-racist city. The series is hosted by the Better Together Advisory Board in partnership with the Decatur City Commission. We want to start by thanking the nearly 200 people from Georgia, Maine, Texas, and Minnesota who we are so honored had decided to digitally come and hang out in our little city today. We have a couple of logistical announcements before we shift to the heart of the program. One, we are very much hoping for a robust question and answer session after the presentation. Please submit your questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen if you're on a laptop, or if you are on a mobile device, it's at the top of the screen. Two, we have turned off the feature that allows for us to capture and share your images. You should only see images of me and Tim doing this webinar. And finally, you will receive a short, about a 2-minute anonymous survey after the program that will inform future events that we will put on. I am Ed Lee. I serve on the Board of Advisory for the Better Together Advisory Board. The board works to generate awareness of and responsive to inequities and injustices in a manner that strives to improve the interactions between community members and city officials, while also serving as a springboard for policy and programmatic changes. The roots of this series are located in our collective acknowledgement that the misunderstanding of insufficient responses to the various ways that racism perverts our policies, our politics, and our social practices cannot be addressed unless we are in conversation with people who have decided to dedicate their lives to understanding and dismantling racism. Our conversations must feature those who are researching and having a nuanced understanding of how race and difference functions in the United States. That is why we are so immensely excited and honored to have Tim Wise join us today. There is much that can be said about Tim. He is a prolific author and activist, challenging us to wrestle with the history and contemporary manifestations of racism and white dominance. His most recent book is entitled Dispatches from the Race War. I can't muster enough words to truly capture the impact that his voice is having on our national conversation about race. So I will share his words from Twitter 3 hours ago.
Oh God.
Folks say, listen to Black women. It's no joke, y'all, and exactly right. As exhibits A through C, the 3 best books written on race and racism in the last several years were written by Black women. White Rage by Emory's very own Professor Carol Anderson, Cass by Isabel Wickerson, and now Mediocre by Ijeoma Oluwa. We are a city that is majority white. We are a city that is dedicated to becoming welcoming and inclusive. The simple fact is that for us to become an anti-racist city, it requires more of our white brothers and sisters and neighbors to learn some of the many lessons that Tim Wise has learned in his journey over the years. We are deeply appreciative that you have decided to join us in conversation. Welcome to Decatur, Tim.
Thank you very much, Ed. And I want to thank you for making that the tweet that you read, because when you said that you were going to read something from my Twitter timeline, I immediately started thinking, oh God, in the last 3 hours, I've said a whole lot of stuff, and some of it may or may not be what you want to share. It all depends on the mood I'm in at that moment. So I appreciate, though, obviously the plug for those 3 women and their work, which is instrumental to our understanding, those of us who are white. If we're going to do this work, and if we're going to do it with any integrity, we have to learn to listen to Black and brown folks, which might seem like an odd thing for me to say as a white man coming to you, asking you to listen to me for the next half hour of my presentation, and then the time after that we'll engage in conversation. But there's no real contradiction there. It's not that we shouldn't, as white folks, use our voices. It's just that we want to make sure that our voices are supplementing and backing up the voices of Black and brown folks, especially Black women, who have done so much of the heavy lifting on this work and on this journey to racial justice and racial equity in our country's history, and who often receive not nearly enough credit for having done that intellectual and emotional and physical labor to make this movement what it is today. And so it is great that you decided to lead off with that, and I'm glad that you chose that one. Let me also say, before I get into my remarks, before we got on, for those who have joined us, Ed was having some issues with his technology, and we were all sort of goofing on him about it. But look, I am certainly not one who is above the possibility of an internet glitch happening. And as a 52-year-old human being, I have no technological skills past about the level of Atari. So if it's any kind of technology past that, or like, early Pac-Man or something, I'm not real adept at it. So it's entirely possible that I'm going to hit a button. I'm going to knock my computer off the little thing here that I've created. I'm going to turn off my microphone or something catastrophic. I do have the link. I will be back quickly if that happens. Just bear with me, and hopefully it won't. Now, as far as my remarks today, it's an honor to be able to talk with you all about the issue of racial justice as it relates to your community and the broader country. It would be an honor at any point, but I think it's especially important in this particular moment. We are still, as I say these words, in the middle of what is the largest sustained racial justice uprising really in the country's history, dating back to the end of May when George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis by Officer Derek Chauvin. And that uprising, which began in late May and really took off in June and lasted throughout the summer, is still very much with us. Even if we're not having daily and weekly demonstrations and rallies, it is still very much in effect. And it is the largest uprising that we've seen in this country. About 23 million individuals have taken part in between 8,000 and 10,000 different demonstrations, rallies, protests, or other public events since the end of May, beginning of June. That is not only impressive, it's really quite historic. And among those participating in that are millions of people who have never taken part in racial justice activism before. And it's happening in communities where those kinds of things have not been seen, not just in the places you'd expect and with the usual suspects whom you would expect to take part, but in places where those kind of things have not happened. Here in Nashville, which of course does have a history of anti-racist and civil rights activism, nonetheless, the demonstration, the big one that was planned here in this city, which had 10, 12, maybe 15,000 people back in June, was put together by 5 or 6 young women between the ages of like 13 and 18. That is impressive. When you have events like that in places like this being organized by young people, you know that something is happening. The question for us right now, though, as a society, 6 or 7 months into this process, is how do we sustain the forward momentum of that movement, and how do we take that movement out of the streets? Not to take it out, but in addition to that movement in the streets, how do we bring that into our day-to-day institutional spots, our schools, our workplaces, our homes, our communities, our nonprofit organizations, our houses of worship, all the different institutional spaces where we inhabit and where we reside and work? How do we make sure that this work is not simply the work of protest and demonstration politics, but also the day-to-day? Because sometimes I do fear that when we think about anti-racist activism or civil rights activism, we're so used to thinking of protest as sort of the end-all be-all of that we forget, however important that is, and it is important, about 90% of the work doesn't look like that. About 90% of the work is not headline grabbing. About 90% of the work is not going to be Instagrammable. About 90% of the work is not going to make the history books. It's sort of like an iceberg where 10% is above the waterline and 90% is below. The 90% is what we have to connect to, because even if you are someone who is out in the streets raising your voice, you know that when you come off of that demonstration or that movement activism that is obviously, important, you have to figure out what you're going to do the other, 6 days out of the week, or the other 364 days out of the year, or whatever the case might be. So I want to talk a little bit about that tonight. And I also want to warn against some of the other things that can sap the energy of this work and help us to sort of but focus in much more carefully on the day-to-day systemic work that we have to do to create racial justice. One of the big fears that I think many of us have in addition to reducing the work all to protest activism, is we also have a tendency to reduce this, especially in an election year like this, to the realm of politics and partisan politics in particular. And we saw this in 2008 when an awful lot of folks, not too many black and brown folks, but an awful lot of white folks in this country seemed to believe that the election of Barack Obama signified that we had turned some permanent corner on the issue of racism in America. Literally, like the day after the election, you would hear these stories of white folks, basically, I mean, I was actually in the airport in Detroit that next day, and the day after Obama won in 2008. And there were white people like running up to black people and congratulating them. Like all black people were in Barack Obama's personal Rolodex or speed dial. One white woman went up and hugged a gate agent at D12. I don't know what that was about, other than maybe she thought that, Denise, the gate agent at D12, was a friend of Senator Obama, then President-elect Obama. I don't know what it was, but there was this sort of sense on the part of a lot of white folks, like, oh, thank God, this is so great. We've attained this place. And of course, it never made sense any more than it would have made sense to say that sexism had been eradicated in Pakistan when Benazir Bhutto was elected in that country, not once, but twice, to be the head of state there. Of course, later she was assassinated. So it lets you know how some folks felt about her. But just as we wouldn't have said patriarchy and misogyny had been eradicated there or in any of the other countries that have had women as heads of state, of which there have been dozens, unlike ours, which still has not, but where there have been so many of those countries, all of them still sexism, misogyny, rape culture exists there. So too, racism can exist even in a country, as we know, with a black president. So we don't want to assume that the changing of the guard politically, whether it was Obama in 2008 or now the changing and the elimination or the ending of the Trump administration, is going to somehow bring the country just by itself to a place of racial ecumenism or racial equity. Because all of the problems that exist right now with regard to racial disparities in healthcare, racial disparities in criminal justice, racial disparities in education, racial disparities in wealth and income, and any category that you choose to focus upon. All of those disparities predated the Trump administration, and all of those disparities are going to be with us after the Trump administration. They have existed throughout every administration, Democrat or Republican, in measured history, since we've been keeping the numbers on those things. Not to say that, who's president doesn't matter. Obviously, these things do matter. Elections matter, and they have consequences, and things can get better or they can get worse. But we cannot afford to rest on the idea that because one party is in power and another party is out of power, that in and of itself is going to solve the problem. So many of these things are deeply embedded in the society. Wealth disparity, for example, right now, typical white family about 10 to 12 times the net worth of the typical black family. That was true when Barack Obama was president. It's been true all the time that Donald Trump has been president. It's going to be true all throughout the Biden years unless we do something as a society to change that. The disproportionality of not only stop and frisk and racial profiling, but also police involved shootings in this country disproportionately against black and brown folks, even when unarmed and posing no threat to the officer. That was obviously happening during the Obama years. Before that, the George W. Bush years. Before that, the Bill Clinton years, and on back down the line. So we can't reduce this to mere politics. No matter who the president is, no matter who controls Congress, no matter who controls the Senate, we are going to have an obligation to keep the pressure on for racial justice, because these things don't change just because the hands on the clock move and the pages on the calendar turn. For those of us old enough to remember, like old wall calendars where you actually turn things. I know that's sort of an antiquated reference for some, but in any event, we have to do the work. And my fear, and I think it's a fear shared by a lot of folks who do this work, is that we will sort of rest on our laurels, as some did after 2008, and assume that now the issues are not there or not as present any longer, when in fact they are. Another problem, and I think this is really the bigger one, those two were sort of minor, the issue of reducing the struggle to protest and reducing it to politics. This one's quite a bit bigger. I worry that we're going to misunderstand the nature of the problem, right? When I say the problem, I mean the problem of racism itself. So oftentimes when we think about racism, we reduce that to personal badness, right? Personal misconduct, personal bigotry, personal prejudice, personal hate. And so it becomes very easy to say, racism is those boys in Charlottesville in 2017, marching around the campus at the University of Virginia and through the streets of Charlottesville with Confederate flags or Nazi flags, yelling English translation versions of German Nazi slogans from World War II. And we look at that and we say, well, that's what racism is, or that's what white supremacy is. Or perhaps even more recently, we look at an officer like Derek Chauvin with his knee in the neck of George Floyd for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And we say that right there, that's what racism looks like. And far be it for me to deny that. I mean, those boys in Charlottesville were certainly the epitome of what white supremacists look like. And Derek Chauvin, based on his depraved indifference to the life that he was snuffing for nearly 9 minutes, clearly fits the bill as well. I won't argue the point. But what I think we have to remember is that racism, by definition, not because I say so, not because some political ideology says so, but because basic grammar tells me so, racism is a system. It ends with those letters, ISM, and like other words that are isms, capitalism, socialism, communism, fascism, authoritarianism, totalitarianism, you can think of several. Most of the time when words end with those letters, we're talking about not just ideologies, although it is that. So in the case of racism, it would be the ideology of, white superiority, for instance. But it's not just that. It's also a system. Isms are ideologies and systems. And at the level of systems, right, we have to think about how systems are maintained. Are they sometimes maintained by overtly bigoted people? Sure. But do they require overtly bigoted and hateful people to be maintained? The answer to that is no. Systems and institutions operate using policies, practices, and procedures, operating under processes that become normal to us and which we never think about and we never interrogate. And even if they aren't deliberately intended to produce vast racial disparities, can have that consequence. Those policies, those practices, those procedures can perpetuate inequity in terms of schools, in terms of jobs, in terms of income and wealth, in terms of the justice system, even if that isn't the intention of the people in those institutional spaces. I want to talk about that. And the reason I want to focus on that is because the other part's easier, right? To talk about overt racism, I'm not even talking about neo-Nazis necessarily, or, semi-psychotic law enforcement officials that snuff out a life for nearly 9 minutes. Those are extreme examples. But just even baseline discrimination is at least technically illegal, right? So at least theoretically, we have a legal framework to address racial discrimination that's obvious in the job market, or racial discrimination that's obvious in lending, or racial discrimination that's obvious in any other institutional space like schooling. The problem is that so much of what perpetuates racial inequity in this country isn't illegal in the first place, that unless we address that part, unless we address the part that is creating injustice, but which is actually completely legal, the civil rights laws don't touch those things. If we don't address that, we're only dealing, going back again to the iceberg metaphor, with maybe the 10% of the racism that we can easily see, and we're ignoring the 90%. So when I talk about that 90%, the systemic piece, the stuff that's under the waterline and that isn't even against the law that we sometimes miss, what am I talking about? And how does that relate to your community and mine here in Nashville, or any other community to which I could be speaking? Well, let's think about a few examples. And these will be obvious, and there are probably others that you can think of, and we can talk about that during the Q&A and the dialogic part of the evening together. But you think about education, think about schooling, right? We live in a country where we take unstandardized children from unstandardized families, living in unstandardized homes, in unstandardized communities, going to unstandardized schools, teaching unstandardized curriculum with unstandardized resources. And then at the end of all that, we give them standardized tests to determine if they're going to graduate from high school. If so, are they going to go to college? If so, what kind of college? In fact, we start this process long before high school. We start giving standardized tests to these unstandardized kids with unstandardized resources from like first grade on, earlier than just about any other country on the planet that we like to compare ourselves to. We start that process of sorting and separating and tracking. Now, what happens when you give standardized examinations to unstandardized kids who weren't taught the same stuff and who didn't have the same resources to master the same material? Well, what happens is that by definition, you perpetuate inequity, right? It doesn't have to be deliberate. I don't think that most teachers or that most principals or that most guidance counselors or that most admissions officers in colleges are overtly bigoted. I know the guy who's the head of the college board. These are the folks responsible for the SAT. I happen to know he's a lovely human being who is not, in fact, an overt bigot. Has nothing to do with anything. When you take unstandardized kids whose unstandardization tracks economics and tracks color, right? And then you give them all the same exam, you are by definition going to elevate some, you're going to favor the favored, and you're going to disfavor and marginalize the disfavored and the marginalized. You don't have to do it on purpose. It's just the result. It would be one thing if we gave standardized tests to everybody so that we could gauge our effectiveness as educators, right? So like that might be a good reason to use standardized tests. Make sure we're reaching everybody. So let's give everybody the same test. And that way we know if we're failing as teachers, we know if we're failing as communities, but that's not how we use these tests. We don't use these tests to gauge and then fix the failings of the school system. We use these tests as a gatekeeping mechanism to either provide or to restrict opportunity. That is an institutionally racist process and institutionally classist process because it perpetuates disparity, whether or not that is the intent. So when we talk about systemic racism, we have to think about that. Or when we think about the job market, for instance, you ask any employer, when you're hiring people, what do you look for? And they say, well, we look for the, people with the most qualifications, and we look at the resumes, and we hire based on experience, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we do that to some extent. But what we know, because there was a study to this effect, it was written up in the New York Times 5 or 6 years ago, I doubt things have changed since then, found that in the wake of the Great Recession, what was that, 2009, 2010 or so, finally come out of it around 2010, 2011, we're starting to. After the Great Recession, about half of the new jobs in the post-recession economy, and this is likely still the case, about half the new jobs, 47%, as I recall, were being filled not through some open competition where we just all throw our resumes in a pile and the most qualified person, whatever that means, gets the job. Almost half of the jobs were being filled through networking, and not just like broad-based networking, but one particular form of networking. People who already work for the company writing letters of recommendation on behalf of people they knew, friends, family, neighbors, golfing buddies, whatever, right? To try to get them a job. In other words, if I know Jim over in the HR department, Jim writes me a letter, now I got the inside track on that new gig. Or if I know Peter over in, accounting, right? Peter can write me a letter and I got the inside track on that new gig. Now, in theory, that doesn't have anything to do with race. But in practice, what do you think it has to do with race? Well, we know because the research finds that the people that are more likely to know Jim are going to be people like Jim, right? No offense to Jim. Jim might be a good guy, but the people Jim's likely to know, the people who existing employees of a company or an organization or a firm or whatever are more likely to know are people like themselves. And therefore, the people for whom they'll write those letters of reference tend to be very much like themselves, which means that white folks and white men in particular, and upper middle class white men in particular, will have the inside track on those jobs, not because they're the most qualified, not because they're the best for the job, but because they know the right people. So if that's how half the jobs are being filled, even if not a single HR director in America were racist, even if not a single employer were overtly bigoted, the outcomes in terms of who is hired will be pretty much the same as if half of them were bigots, right? Or as if half of them harbored those racist prejudices or sexist prejudices or classist prejudices. You could be the most qualified person for that next opening at the firm or the company or whatever, but if you're a person of color or a woman of any color or a working class white guy for that matter, you're out of luck. You don't even know that the job exists. We sometimes talk about, inequality of opportunity using a racetrack metaphor, and we say, some people are starting out 3 laps behind in a 5-lap race, which is bad enough, and I'll come back to that. This is worse than that. This is not even knowing there's a race. Right? Not even knowing where the track is at, like not even knowing that there's a competition that you could even potentially enter if you don't know the right people. So that's how institutional inequity can be perpetuated. Systemic racist exclusion can be perpetuated without a single overt bigot in the room. Now, let's think about the other half, right? The other half of the jobs where theoretically it's an open competition. But is it really? I mean, we think about everybody submitting a resume, filling out job applications, just sending in letters of reference, et cetera. Is that really an objective process? Well, the research would tend to say that it's not, but common sense will also tell you that it's not. Because after all, if I have in fact had more opportunity than you, I should look better on paper, right? If I do have a 3-lap head start in a 5-lap race, I ought to hit the tape first. That's how racing works. Right? Doesn't mean that I'm the faster runner. In fact, if I start out 3 laps ahead of you, and at the end of the 5-lap race, I'm only like a lap ahead or maybe a half lap ahead, by definition, you were the faster runner. But see, we live in a winner take all society where the only thing we look at is who hit the tape, right? Where the tape, metaphorically speaking, is the SAT score, the ACT score, the LSAT score, or the resume, right? Which reflects not just my abilities, not just my talent, but it reflects my opportunities. What access have I had? And so if I'm an employer, I need to learn how to look at those things in an objective, holistic way that takes account of the systemic inequities that produce credentials or not, right? Because a person's credentials are not simply a reflection of their talent, their ability, their hard work, or their determination. It is a reflection of sociological reality. Who has had access and who has not, who has had more and who has had less. If we're not thinking about that, if we're not thinking about the ways that our normative procedures, from standardized testing to resume-based hiring to networking for hiring, can produce inequality, we will continue to perpetuate inequity and not even realize we're doing it. And none of that's illegal. So none of that can be solved by filing a lawsuit. None of that is addressed by the Civil Rights Act. None of that is addressed by the laws as they exist. Or think about housing, right? I live in Nashville, which, as some of you may know, apparently is the place to be. I was born and reared here. I didn't know that it was going to become the place to be. And when I left in the mid 1980s, if you had told me that it was going to be the place to be, I would have laughed at you. But now it is apparently the place where all the bachelorettes come for their parties and where some of y'all come to get on pedal taverns and drink while you exercise, which I will never understand, but y'all do you. In any event, we're the place to be now, apparently. And yet we're also a place where, because it's the place to be and people are moving here, right, as they are throughout the entire greater Atlanta area. So y'all certainly know about this as well, right? That when people are moving to your spot, what happens? Well, housing becomes increasingly unaffordable, right? As people move in, demand goes up, folks start gouging the prices. Now it becomes virtually impossible, as it has here in Nashville, for young folks just starting out to actually live in the city where they might work. I mean, I couldn't possibly have moved here when I moved back here when I was in my late 20s, if it were as expensive as it is now. You got young folks having to move 30 minutes away because the housing is too expensive. How is that a race issue? Well, think about this, right? What happens in some of these urban communities and first ring suburban communities, where maybe even first or second ring suburban communities now, where folks are moving and where you have zoning laws like here in Nashville that perpetuate unaffordable housing and racial exclusion. So what do we do here? In Nashville, we have a zoning rule that says that for every unit of housing that you build that's like condo or apartment, and they're all over the place. I mean, they're building them on every corner, it seems. For every new unit of such housing, you have to have 2 parking spots. Now, I want you to think about the effect of zoning laws like that. 2 parking spots for every unit. What happens when I do that? That means I got to build a lot of parking lots and a lot of parking garages to take care of all these cars, right, that people are going to have. Means I have to take land out of circulation that people could live on so that we can park cars in them, which means that we're going to, perpetuate over-reliance on vehicles, which is not good for the environment. It's also going to create more gridlock on our interstates, which nobody within like 50 miles of Atlanta has to doubt what that's about. Everybody knows, right? You get that kind of road rage and gridlock and time and traffic, which has been the case in the area where you all are since like the mid 70s, right? And it's now that way here in Nashville. But it also means that the housing prices skyrocket because you have less land for people to live on. That means whatever's left, they have to charge more for rent. The mortgage rates go up. I mean, the cost of housing goes up for people who want to buy a condo and own that outright. And so people can't afford to live there. Who are the folks that get pushed out of those communities? Well, the urban communities first. You have lower income and working class Black and brown folks who get pushed out to that first ring suburb. Then folks start moving there. They get pushed out to the second ring suburb. Then they get pushed out to the now what we call ex-urban areas, right? And all of that cost increase ends up having not just an economic impact, but a racial impact. Is that deliberate? Are the zoning boards filled with people who are, overtly racist? I don't know. Maybe there are. I'm sure there are people like that, right? Who definitely want to keep certain people out based on race and based on class. But even if they don't, even if it's a purely sort of economic thing where we just want to have, we really want to have, high cost housing because that makes us feel, I don't know, more prestigious or whatever. Like, even if there's no overtly racist motivation, the effect is racially disparate housing access and opportunity, as with standardized testing doing that for education, as with old boys networks doing that for jobs. And you can think about, how this works in other realms of life as well. Probably think about that with regard to healthcare. You could think about that with regard to law enforcement and policing, the way that resources get deployed, right? Which may or may not be about overt bias, but the consequences of those actions are to perpetuate racial injustice. But there's one thing above all else that does this, and we have to really critically think about this in our institutional spaces, not just at the municipal level within a city or a community or a town, but also the businesses, the schools, and all the institutions in those towns. One of the biggest problems, and it's one that we are loath to respond to or to address, I think, but unless we address it, I don't think we can really ever move to a racially just society, is the fourth P. I said three Ps: policy, practice, and procedure. There's a fourth P that gets us in trouble, and that is paradigm, right? A way of thinking, a way of understanding the world, the lens through which we observe reality. And in this country, our dominant paradigm or way of understanding the world is through this lens of meritocracy and what we like to call rugged individualism, right? This idea that, well, wherever you end up is all about your own effort. And if you just work hard, you can make it. Anybody can make it in America, right? That's our secular gospel. If America were a Bible, that would be Genesis 1:1, right? The very first part. And I know why we do it. It's supposed to be empowering to young people. You can be anything. I got two daughters, 19 and 17, and I understand the incentive to want to say you can be anything you want if you work hard. The problem is that, well, it's multifold. Number one, we've been saying that about this country. Even we said that during segregation. I mean, we said that when women couldn't vote. We said that at a time when Black and brown folks didn't have schools to go to. We've always, sort of repped that mythology, even when it clearly wasn't true, even when the laws were not in place to even theoretically make it true. So it's always been a myth. And the problem is, if we tell people that you can be anything you want without giving them the tools to understand the things that get in the way of that, unless we give them the tools to critically analyze when that's true, when it's not true, if it's true, if it's not true, then what happens is you have people growing up looking around, seeing the inequalities, which, we can all see with our own eyes, and then coming to the conclusion that they must be normal and that those inequalities must be natural, because after all, if anybody can make it in America, if they just try hard, then the fact that some people aren't making it must be their fault, right? And the people that are making it, they just must be that much smarter. So the fact that there are 400 white people in this country who have more wealth than all 40 million Black people combined, true statistic, by the way, must mean that those 40 million Black folks haven't worked as hard as those 400 white people for real. Does anybody actually believe that? I hope not. But one would almost have to believe that, at least implicitly, if you buy the propaganda of the culture. If I say wherever I end up is all about me, the winners start to assume that they're superior. The losers start to internalize a sense of their own inferiority. And the winners also look down on the so-called losers as inferior. And then we never solve the problem. How are you going to solve racial disparity if you believe the disparities are natural? How are you going to solve class disparity, gender disparity, if you believe that those things reflect natural ability, talent, or cultural depravity versus cultural supremacy? You're never going to do it. We will end up rationalizing them and maintaining them. So we have to be brave enough to stand up and to challenge that mentality of rugged individualism. It isn't true. None of us were raised on an island by a porpoise. We all had help, whether that was from family or from friends or from mentors or a teacher in third grade that believed in us when nobody else did. We've all had help. The difference is that some of us are willing to talk about that and acknowledge that help, and acknowledge that sometimes the help has been color coded. And sometimes it's been class coded and gender coded, right? Some of it is about being white in a white dominated society, being male in a male dominated society, being affluent in a society where money talks. And we have to be honest enough to acknowledge that, not to take away from our hard work if we've worked hard, but to acknowledge that some of us have had our hard work met with access to an opportunity structure and others haven't. And until we have an opportunity structure that works for everyone, that problem will continue to persist, and we will be part of that problem. Which then brings me to one final thing I want to mention before we do the conversation part. Why, having said all of this, having talked about the disparities, having identified what some of those look like, and having identified the way in which they tend to, benefit the dominant group at the expense of everyone else, the question some people ask me, and it's a good question, is why would the dominant group want to change that, right? Why would people in positions of relative advantage want a different society? Let me suggest to you, we're seeing right now in real time some of the reasons why the answer to that question should be obvious. Some of the biggest problems we have in our country right now are a reflection of our unwillingness to get a hold of this issue of racial disparity. Think about the coronavirus crisis. We've had 250,000 people who've died. And you have to ask yourself why. Why has the United States, among all countries, singularly bungled the response to this pandemic? Why? Why is it that the most powerful, ostensibly the wealthiest nation on earth, has done the absolute crappiest at responding to this pandemic? Well, I would suggest to you, you can't separate that from the fact that we're one of the only such countries, at least among industrialized nations, that doesn't have a functional public health infrastructure and guarantees of healthcare access for all people as a matter of universality. We're one of the few that doesn't allow people paid leave and or job protections if they have to stay at home from work. So in this country, you got to keep going to work or else you lose your paycheck and your ability to support your family, because we don't believe in safety nets the way that those other countries do. So that keeps people in the workforce being exposed to the pandemic, spreading the pandemic. We don't prioritize universal health care, so folks don't have access to go in to get care if they're feeling bad, or to stay home and to receive the kind of care that they need. And those kinds of inequities track class and they track race. So because we have this Swiss cheese kind of safety net, people fall through the cracks. The irony is that then haunts the whole society. Everybody ends up paying the price for that inadequacy, right? And if you look back to the beginning of this pandemic, April 7th, very interesting thing happened. April 7th of this year, New York Times and Washington Post both have headlines talking about how coronavirus is disproportionately killing Black people. Before that time, we didn't know that. There might have been suspicions of it, but we didn't know it. Very interesting thing happened. Prior to April 7th, when that headline hits, Tucker Carlson, right? Conservative talk show host on Fox, the most popular right-wing talk show host on Fox, and probably in the country right now. Prior to April 7th, he had been going on his show and trying to tell viewers, listen, this thing is real. He wasn't like Limbaugh. He wasn't like some of these other folks saying that it was a hoax or it was just like the flu. He was saying, no, this is serious. We got to take it seriously. That morning, when the New York Times and Washington Post headlines come out that say it's disproportionately killing Black people, that evening, Tucker Carlson goes on television and says, maybe it's not as serious as we thought. Right? And 3 days later, the president says, we got to open everything back up. We can't stay closed. We got to get back to work. All of a sudden, right, there's this big push to reopen. Now, is that a coincidence that that big push comes just as we find out who's doing the disproportionate dying? See, I would say that that's not coincidental. So all of a sudden, folks are showing up at state capitals with camo, showing up with, with their semi-automatic weapons, demanding a reopening of the economy. That's what kept the coronavirus active the way that it was all through the summer. And that's why we're here looking at Christmas, still having this problem. But what's the irony? The irony is that even though it disproportionately has affected Black and brown folks, about 130,000, 140,000 white folks have died too. Older white folks, folks with pre-existing conditions, folks, diabetic spouses and immunocompromised children and parents and grandparents. So the irony is that by not taking it as seriously as we would have if the dead had been disproportionately whiter and younger and wealthier, right? Because, you know, if it had been, we would have taken it more seriously. By having a more nonchalant response based on the disparity and the racialization of the impact, we ended up then not doing what we needed to do to protect those 130, 140,000 white folks as well. This is how these things come back around. The opioid crisis is another example. Why are we in that mess? Well, because for 30 years, white folks voted for politicians that promised to treat drugs like a moral failing and a crime problem rather than a public health problem, because it was those people being locked up, those people going to prison. And now what's happening? Millions of white folks have suffered and families have suffered at the loss of loved ones due to the opioid crisis, or the pain of addiction, and they're sitting there wondering, where's the rehab, where's the treatment? Well, the rehab and the treatment facilities aren't there because that isn't what we put our money into. We put our money into locking those people up, and now we find that the programs we need are missing as well. So we have an interest in this. We have what the late great law professor Derek Bell called interest convergence between the needs of Black and brown folks on the one hand and the needs of white folks and the larger society on the other. If we don't take seriously the obligation to create racial equity and to uproot systemic racism in our different institutions, we'll keep having this conversation 5 years, 10 years, 15, 20 years from now. And at that time, it is going to be far harder to stitch together whatever is left of the potential of multiracial democracy. So we have to make that commitment now, take advantage of this opening that has been given to us as a result of this uprising and as a result of the tragedies of the last 7 or 8 months. Take advantage of the tragedy in a way that allows us to move forward and to turn the corner toward justice, so that we can, if not redeem the loss of life, at least ensure that those who have died thus far will not have died in vain. And I thank you all so much for hanging out with me for my portion of the event. Looking forward to the conversational part with Ed, and then the Q&A after that with those who have joined us. And again, thank you all so much for having me. I appreciate it.
So, this is not where I thought that I was going to start this portion of the conversation, but when you were talking about the misunderstanding of the nature of the problem being one of really the core issues that we need to get over, I start to think about Eddie Galad's Democracy in Black, where he makes the argument that we spend too much time talking about the spectacular of Trumpianism and the way in which we think about the optics and the aesthetics, and not enough time thinking about the everydayness. And while he didn't use your 4 Ps of policies, practices, procedures, and paradigms, that's what he was talking about. And it ties in with, in some ways, Isabel Wilkerson's Cass. Is there a value for us to start adding in some different language like Cass that is about power and structure and resources, and less about racism, because that leads us to think about it in individual ways? Right. I am individually racist.
Yeah, I think that Isabel Wilkerson's book is valuable for precisely that reason, that it is an attempt to reframe our system. And she uses at one point in the book the term casteism, sort of tongue in cheek, realizing no one's going to get it. No one, we're not used to that. But we need to think of it in those terms, because the difference between understanding caste and understanding race or racism is not just that which you allude to, which is that racism is such an individualized term, and caste is obviously, almost by definition, we think of it in India, for instance, as a much more systematized, structured thing. That's one aspect of it. But the other aspect is that unless you use the language of caste, unless you understand that what we really have is a caste system, it becomes impossible to understand the voting and political behavior of broad swaths of white people. Right. So in other words, here's what I mean by that. And she talks about this in her book, and I've talked about this for years. You'll always have white liberals and white leftists. So traditional liberals and people who are further left, all sort of asking the same question after elections. Why do these working class white people, or middle class white people, anything but rich white people, why do they keep voting against their interest? That's the rhetoric that we sometimes use. I have used that rhetoric many, many years ago myself. I don't use it anymore. And the reason I don't is because of something Isabel Wilkerson speaks to in her book, which is when we say that, we are assuming that they are voting against their interest rather than realizing they are simply defining their interests differently and very logically based on a caste system. In other words, yeah, I'm working class, but why would I choose to identify as that? That's the loser category that I'm in. Why would I want to identify as a loser when, if I identify as white, I get to identify with the winning team? You're asking me, I could identify with the 1927 Yankees. And you're wanting me to identify with like the 1962 Mets? Why would I do that? Right? I want to identify with the winner, not the loser. So if I have a choice, and this is the difference that like white Marxists never understood this, right? This sort of idea that, oh, well, people will always vote their material interest and that, workers will come to realize their own. That's nonsense. They won't, because in this country, we have given workers an off-ramp if they're white called whiteness. We also have an off-ramp of masculinity traditionally defined. We have an off-ramp of heterosexuality. I can decide to cleave to these other identities where I feel powerful. And if I feel like getting a better deal in the class game is too much work, like I got to actually fight the boss, man, like I know he's ripping me off, but damn, yeah, if I did that, maybe I'd get better wages, but I got this property right now. I got this is I can deposit this every day and I'll just bank what I got. And so what Wilkerson is saying is if we understood caste, what we need to do, we have to figure out a way. And she doesn't necessarily give us the answer on how to do this. We all have to figure this out. We have to figure out a way to pathologize the caste system, even for the people at the top of it, right? Not by trying to get them to identify with a different identity that's a loser identity, because they ain't going to do that, but actually get them to understand why even the winner identity is toxic to them. That's going to be the trick. And that's not going to be an easy thing to do, but that's why the language shift is so important.
Yeah, what you're speaking to is Cheryl Harris's notions of the property of whiteness. Mm-hmm. And we have this cottage industry that crops up after every election that asks the fundamental question that you just asked. Why are people voting the way that they have voted? And Charles Blow had an article recently in the New York Times where he identified that white folks were the only majority to vote for Trump, but then goes on to sort of ask that same question. And I think you're right. We have an answer to why that choice is being made. It's the property nature of whiteness. There is some benefit to identifying that way.
Well, let me give you an example. A very interesting personal one. So several years ago, it's been 20 years now, in 2000, I wrote a piece for online distribution just talking about the Confederate flag. And it was at a time when that debate was starting to ramp up in South Carolina in particular. And I wrote a piece, explaining what the Confederacy was and was not about, that indeed it was premised on the maintenance of white supremacy and chattel enslavement. And as you can imagine, even in an era before things went viral, before social media or anything else, it did go viral. And a lot of the neo-Confederate groups and right-wing groups, emailed me all kinds of horrible stuff. And I, was fielding that for months and months. I got in this one argument with this young kid, college student from South Carolina, who was, defending the Confederacy, defending the flag, all this nonsense. And back in those days, I was a lot younger. I didn't have kids yet. So I would indulge foolishness. I've learned I don't indulge it anymore, but 20 years ago, we were good. I could talk to you for weeks. So I talked to this young man for like a week and a half. And I went back and forth trying to explain to him how the Confederacy and the things that it fought for and the system of white supremacy that both prefaced it and then lived on after it actually had harmed the South, how it had actually brought down the wages of all workers. It guaranteed we weren't going to have unions because racists didn't want to have unions, because then you'd have solidarity wages across racial lines. So, you didn't have unions because you didn't want to work side by side with Black people getting the same amount of pay. So I went through this whole sort of pseudo-Marxist economic analysis about how the working class was worse off because of racism. And at the end of the week and a half, he finally wrote to me and he said, oh man, you're probably right. I mean, and I felt real good. I read that first line and I'm like, I got him, right? And then came the other line where he said, you're probably right, but I'd be willing to work for $1 an hour if we could just go back to segregation. And I had nothing else to say, right? Because at that point, what do I do? See, and what was that kid saying? We can say, well, he's just being irrational. And on one level, he is. Obviously, to say that you'd be willing to work for 40 bucks a week is irrational, right? But in a caste system that has made his whiteness equivalent to property, what he said was, I'm willing to suffer as long as you suffer more than me, right? I'm willing to suffer as long as I'm not suffering as long as I don't finish last, I'm okay. It's like that old line that they say, you know, that joke about the two people in the woods and they get approached by a grizzly bear and they're trying to figure out how to, and then one guy goes, you know, do you think you can outrun the bear? I'm like, I don't have to outrun the bear. I just got to outrun you, right? It's that kind of thing. That's the sickness of the system. And I don't think that kid that I was talking to was reachable, but I hope that other white folks, when they hear that story, start to realize, oh my God, like that, this is what it's doing to our children, our niece and nephew, our uncle, our parents, our friends. This is what it's doing to us. It's actually causing us to settle for less, which is something that Jomo Luo talks about in her book that I referenced in the tweet and that you mentioned, Mediocre. She's talking about that. She's like, the mediocrity of white male leadership is something that we only put up with because at least we're above those people. We would never put up with this level of mediocrity, 250,000 people dead from coronavirus, but you know, at least they're the ones doing most of the dying. The hell, that is completely dysfunctional, but it makes perfect sense in a caste system. It's a sick kind of sense, but it does make sense.
You mentioned paradigms as one of the P's, and meritocracy as one of those corrosive paradigms that informs also how our educational system works and how we facilitate the maldistribution of resources. There's also notions of academic freedom that allows for people to say and write whatever they want, regardless of its impact on other folks, and elitist competition that operates in order to distribute sort of the spoils within that. And there's a question about how do we start to change and shift those paradigms so that teaching and educational systems are really grounded in questions of justice and distributions of resources in ways that are much fairer.
Right. Well, I think we have to frame this discussion and moving forward on these issues in a paradigm of interest convergence. As I said there at the end, Derek Bell, you know, who we've had a lot of criticism lately of critical race theory. And Derek Bell was one of the founders of that within the legal field in particular. But what people need to understand about critical race theory is that part of the argument here is that because racism is so embedded in the structures of the society historically, we're not going to be able to uproot it simply by passing some laws, simply by, you know, changing some cultural norms. We're going to have to actually uproot systems if we want to get to a more just society. And what he talked about in much of his writing was that and he had plenty of evidence for it, that the only times that we'd really made progress in this country wasn't because white folks woke up and said, oh my God, we've been holding these people in bondage for a couple hundred years. We should stop. Oh my God, we've been lynching and segregating and doing these horrible things. We should stop. What happened was that in these various moments of history, to preserve the Union or to, you know, put a good face on America during the Cold War propaganda period with the Soviet Union, we had to make certain reforms. Derek Bell talked about the fact that, you know, we get Brown v. Board and we get the Civil Rights Revolution, not because white folks were like, oh my God, this system is rotten, we should uproot it, but because what was going on at that moment was you had colonialism falling apart. You had black and brown nations all around the globe coming out from under the heel of colonial powers, looking around to see what model were they going to follow. We didn't want them to follow the Soviet model of socialism or communism. But you can't sell your model if you're oppressing people that look like those folks. So now you got to have certain reforms. And Derek Bell was saying, that's the only time we've had any progress. Now, I want to take that one step forward. When Professor Bell was saying it, he was saying it somewhat cynically. He was saying, look, this interest convergence brings about reforms that don't really change the system. And he's right. But what I would suggest is we've got some areas of interest convergence right now, this mass death around COVID, the opioid epidemic, deindustrialization, and what that's doing not only to urban communities, but rural communities, where we can actually say there is interest convergence in creating justice. This is not charity. This is not something we're doing for these people. This is not us saving those people. This is about saving yourself. This is about self-help in the broadest, most honest sense of that term. I think if we reframe it that way, if we reframe racial justice not as something we do for others, but as something that we realize we have an investment in as well, then we broaden the concept of self-interest beyond the self. Now we're thinking about it in a collective communal sense, and that changes everything. Our problem right now is we're locked in to that hyper individualistic, atomized sense of self-interest, which basically encourages short-term thinking. And so I think communities have to talk about equity and justice as something that will pay dividends for literally just about everyone. Maybe not the people in the top 1/10, 1/100th of 1%. They're probably far better off with things the way they are, but I ain't worried about them. I'm worried about the rest, who I know are either short-term or long-term damaged by this system. So it's that language that we use that either brings people to the table or I think keeps them away from the table.
Yeah, and I would add prison reform is one of those places where there is some interest convergence that the fact that we had Trump trying to run a campaign on the fact of reducing the number of folks who are in prisons. Some people read that in some fairly cynical ways, and maybe they should. But the reality is that there are a significant number of people who are no longer in prisons because that was aligned with where he wanted politics to go and what he thought as attempts to get reelected. So there are places where those overlap.
Right. Well, and police violence is a good example. I mean, it's funny when we talk about disproportionality in police involved shootings, and the data is very clear on that, right? Disproportionately against Black and brown folks, even when unarmed and posing no threat. But the rebuttal people will bring forward is always, well, but there are more white people, who were shot and killed by police than there are Black people. Well, there are more white people around. So statistically, that just makes sense. But more importantly, how is that a rebuttal? If I tell you that there's disproportionate killing of Black and brown folks by cops, and your comeback is, well, they kill lots of white people too, it sort of begs the question, why do they kill so many white people? And the answer to that question is because law enforcement in America developed under a paradigm of controlling Black people and not giving a damn what they did to Black people. Don't be surprised when the system you created to control those people ends up killing some of your own. Don't be shocked. Right? We've given police permission to brutalize in ways that no other country does. And anyone who thinks that's a coincidence, that that's not related to the history of policing and racism, is just not paying attention. Either we have got the most psychopathic law enforcement or the most criminal citizens of any country on earth, or we have a system that was forged in the needs of white supremacy, and which now is claiming as collateral damage some of the people who it was intended to protect. Don't be surprised, be outraged by that. But instead we use that like that's a comeback, like, well, my cousin got shot too, so y'all need to be quiet. Well, your cousin got shot precisely because Black lives don't matter in this country. If they did, your white cousin would still be with us possibly, and those white folks that are locked up on some BS charges, they, same thing. We'd have rehab facilities for drugs, not jail cells, if it weren't for that. When Black lives don't matter to the larger society, nobody's lives really matter. And that's what we're seeing in all of these different areas. So the areas of interest convergence are apparent if we're prepared to seize on them and to demand better for all of us.
Yeah, what you're speaking to reminds me of the importance of history, that when we talk about dominating the streets as a way of controlling people, the blueprint of that goes back to the Willie Lynch letters of how do we control the slaves who are attempting to run away from the plantation. And so there is a history that's here, and particularly when talking about policing. And one of the difficulties that some people have, I think particularly people who are of the majority of race, is how do they have these conversations? That far too often there are attempts to facilitate and engage in conversations, and discomfort starts to creep in amongst our white brethren, our white sistren. And we err on the side of cocooning them from the reality of the history and the contemporary mode of politics that exerts a tremendous amount of violence on people who do not look like them, love like them, and think like them. Yeah. What can those people who are of the majority race do to help bring others along? Are there suggestions of readings? Are there strategies that you have in mind that you can offer?
Well, in addition to trying to frame it as a matter of interest convergence, which allows, I think, in and of itself, a certain degree of reduction of defensiveness, right? Because I'm framing this as, hey, this is something you need to know for your well-being as well. This is not a guilt trip or, shaming and blaming. This is about saving everybody. In addition to that, I think one of the ways that we have to engage people who are reticent to wade into this is to acknowledge that the odds are good. There was a time when we were also reticent. And now I'm speaking to other white folks who sort of get it, because I don't think it's black and brown folks' job to coddle white people or to teach white folks. I mean, if black and brown folks want to teach us stuff, hey, that is a gift. And that, I mentioned those 3 Black women's books because those are opportunities to get taught without having to call Carol Anderson on the phone and be like, hey, Professor Anderson, tell me what I need to know. You can just read her book, right? Or her books now. But what I would say for those of us who are white, if we're dealing with family or colleagues or friends or neighbors or whatever, look, number one, one thing you don't do is woke scold other white people for not getting what you think you get. This is another problem in this moment, right? Where you have some white folks who have come into some learning. Maybe they read some of those books I mentioned, or they've read other books. Maybe they've read some of my stuff, maybe, and they all of a sudden in the last 8-9 months have seen all these things. And now they're out in the streets holding a sign, yelling and screaming, and they're getting angry at Uncle Jim or whatever for not getting it. And they're at Thanksgiving, they're starting in on Aunt Mary. And, and at some point you got to remember, you can't climb down someone else's throat on Thursday for not understanding stuff that you only learned on Monday, figuratively speaking. And that's something we do a lot. We get so caught up in our righteousness that we forget there was a time, maybe not that long ago, when we also didn't get whatever it is we think we get now. So if I want to bring you to where I am, I got to remember where I was maybe a week ago, maybe a month ago, maybe 6 years ago. For me, maybe it's been 30 years or more, right? But I remember the defensiveness that I had around issues like white privilege. I remember, I tell a story in my book, White Like Me, about even after I was doing anti-racism work. I graduated from college. I was doing work against David Duke in Louisiana, fighting the good fight against this Nazi that's running for Senate and for governor. And a couple years after that, I'm doing work in the community. I'm doing all this grassroots stuff. And there's a speaker coming to Loyola University right next to Tulane, where I went, a speaker who now is a friend of mine, but at the time I didn't know her. And it was a speech about white privilege and progressive organizations. And I was just livid. It's like, how in the hell are we going to talk about white privilege? And we don't have time for that. We got to fight the real enemy. And of course, the real enemy was right-wing people. The real enemy was David Duke. The real enemy was anybody but other progressives. And so buddy of mine and I went to this thing, and we didn't cause trouble because we're not like that, but we just went and we sort of silently in our own heads were mocking this conversation. And as we left after it was over, he and I looked at each other and we're just like, God, can you believe that? Oh my God, can't believe this. We're talking about white privilege. What the? And then he looked at me and said, hey, you want to go get high? And I was like, yeah, let's do that. And so we went and smoked weed in the back of Audubon Park, right? In a car, knowing that we weren't going to get arrested. So there we are getting high, talking about, who are these people talking about white privilege? Pass that joint. Like, really? Like, it took me a while to finally realize, oh my God, like that thing that we didn't want to hear about is exactly what we were indulging. Remembering those moments keeps us humble enough to have this conversation with people who aren't there yet. And humility is very important if you're trying to bring people into a movement. There are some folks you're never going to get, but the ones who are gettable, the ones who can, have their horizons broadened, are probably not going to be broadened by statistics and by data and studies and research, at least not at first. What they're going to be brought in by is your own humility, your willingness to struggle with them, and to remember, and maybe even to talk about a time. Like when I joke about that experience, that opens other white folks up to acknowledge privilege, because they realize I'm not going to jump down their throat for denying it, because I'm going to tell you, hey man, there was a time that I didn't see it either. I wasn't thinking about it either. And the more humility we can have around that, the less it becomes, look how smart I am and how much I know, and look how stupid and horrible you are and how little you know. That's, I think, an important technique.
Yeah, I think about, as you're talking, Crystal Fleming's How to Be Less Stupid About Race. Mm-hmm. And she makes a similar suggestion, actually the same suggestion that you're making, that one of the things that we can do is to listen to and amplify the voices of Black women and women who are at the margins and intersections of various identities. And I think that that as you put it, that those folks have already given us a gift, that they have shared their brilliance with us, their ways of seeing the world, processing and thinking about the world. And at the first place that we can start is to reduce the amount of time that we're showing up on Facebook and increase the amount of time that we're putting our faces in their books. Let's do some more reading.
Right. Absolutely. And then don't just share the brilliance that you find in those books, but talk to your friends and family and colleagues about why it affects you. Because this is the mistake sometimes we make, is we think it's enough to say, hey, there's this great book I just read, you should go read it. But what I want to know from you is, why did it impact you? Especially if you're, like for me, I mean, people can tell when I recommend a book, you know enough about my work, you probably can tell why I like it. But for just average everyday folks that maybe are new to this, it's important for you, if you're going to share this with your colleagues or friends or family, to say like, hey, this passage really spoke to me and here's why, or this section really resonated with some of my experience. Because one of the things that we know is that our friends, our colleagues, our family may not listen to Isabel Wilkerson right away. I hope they will. I hope they'll read her book. Carol Anderson, same thing. All these folks that we could talk about, and not just Black women, Ibram Kendi and others. I hope that they'll read all of this stuff. But it's also true that if they're our family, our friends, our colleagues, they have a vested interest in us. So they'll listen to us too. And that means we want to talk about, well, why did that speak to me? A couple of years ago, I remember there were people that were trying to get me to go and do like a series of debates with Ben Shapiro. And I was just like, I have a debate background, as you know, Ed, and I'm more than happy to do it. But not really, because what I have learned outside of the world of competitive debate, academic competitive debate, and even sometimes within that world, as we also know, this stuff becomes a useless exercise and in self-indulgence if we're not careful. And so what I told the people that wanted me to debate Ben, as I said, I'm not interested in debating Ben Shapiro about whether or not racism is real. I'm not going to do that. But what I will do is I'll sit down and have a dialogue with him where the ground rules are, we can't talk about what we think or what we believe. The ground rules are, we can only talk about why we believe it. In other words, why do we believe what we believe, not the what. We're not going to debate racial profiling with data and statistics and studies. You're going to tell me why you don't think it's a problem, and I'm going to tell you why it is. And the rule is, you can't say, well, it isn't because here's data, and I can't say, well, it is because here's data. I have to tell you why I see it the way I see it, and you got to tell me why you see it the way you do. To me, that would be a more valuable exercise, because I know the answer ahead of time. The reason that I see it is because I've seen it. That is to say, with my own eyes. I've had experiences, and Black friends and colleagues of mine have had experiences from which I've learned, and he hasn't had that. That's why he sees the world differently, because his lens has been forged in his life experience, and my lens has been forged in mine. And the value of realizing that is that it allows us to humanize each other and then have real talk conversations, as opposed to assuming that each other are evil or, venal or, deliberately deceptive. I mean, I think that people who are raised not to see stuff won't see stuff. And I think if you're raised to see stuff, you will be more likely to see it. And that means that I want to have that conversation. Why is it that when you read or you hear a Black person talking about their experiences with police, you want to question them? Why? And why don't I? It's not because I'm a more decent human being. It's not that I'm more thoughtful or more caring or more compassionate. It's because I know when I hear that story that it's true, because I've witnessed what is being described. And that's what does it. And if we could get to that place, then we could start to talk about, then we could get to the point where we start talking about objective reality and statistics and data and studies and what reality is. But first, we have to acknowledge our own sort of our lenses and our biases and our perceptual frames in order to have that conversation. And we just tend not to do that. We tend not to do that.
So there was this 2020, for numerous reasons, was really brought to the forefront of discussions in corridors of power and places around racism, and race and social hierarchies, that we didn't expect them to show up. That I'm not, it doesn't, not lost on me that at this moment, if you're a major Fortune 500 corporation, you got to have some statement on your website around what you're doing about racism, or at least your thoughts about that, and saying that it's bad at a minimum. And one of the things that some people say that they are witnessing is that they're hearing things around social justice fatigue, where the leadership says, look at our website. We already have posted that we think racism is bad and police brutality is bad. What else do you want from us?
Right.
And what do you have thoughts on, how do people rhetorically address those sets of concerns when they hear them from their colleagues or from leadership in organizations that they are a part of?
Well, I think we have to be prepared. And this is what I tell every institution when I'm speaking to them about their internal policy, practice, and procedure. We have to be prepared within our institutional spaces to revisit everything and to filter everything that we do through the lens of equity if we're serious about this work. It's interesting. Prior to June, when the movement in this latest iteration really touched off, I think in the previous 25 years that I had been on the road, giving talks, speaking to different audiences, I'd probably done a combined 25 or 30 corporate events. Everything else, community, nonprofit, college, high schools, but not corporate. I've done probably 40 corporate just since June via this mechanism that we're using here, because everybody wants to get out there doing something right now. I don't want to be completely cynical, because I do realize, look, we all have different inflection points and moments where we really do come to greater awareness. So I'm not going to assume that every one of those was just checking a box, or, people that were being cynical. But I do have to wonder, what's the sustainability? And to me, the only thing that makes it sustainable is a recognition that we have to excavate those policies, practices, and procedures. So I'll give you an example. One of the firms that I worked with, I won't identify them, but it's an accounting firm. Wonderful folks. I enjoyed working with them, did a couple things with them. But one of the things that I saw on their website, and I pointed this out to them as something they need to really think about. I went on their website before I did the first event, and they were bragging about the fact that all of their employees at their accounting firm are hired from like the top 4 accounting programs in the United States, right? And I said, okay, who is that for? Like, what are you saying that for? And is there evidence that if you went to the number 7, you're not a good accountant, or like the number 30, that you're not a good, like, that's not even taking into account your personal talents. That's just saying you went to the right place. And who is that going to favor? Well, it's going to favor the favored. It's going to favor the people who've had the most access to those institutions. So if you're going to try to create racial equity in your institution, you got to rethink the way that you market yourself. I said this to Pomona College out in California several years ago. I went there and I noticed on their website, they were bragging, and they still do, about being one of, if not the number 1 liberal arts college in the United States. At the time that they had just been voted that, this many years ago. And they had on their front of their website, the splash page of their website, median SAT score this year was 1470 out of 1600. And I remember going to them and I said, listen, y'all, first off, like, again, what does that tell me? It tells me that you're not likely to have a whole lot of socioeconomic or racial diversity, because we know the way those tests run racially. So you're definitely not going to have a lot of Black folks here. You're not going to have a lot of working class or lower income folks here. So you're leading with that. Like, you're telling me that on the front of your website. And you're also setting yourself up, right? Because this isn't even functional for your school. If your median right now is 1470, which is insane if you think about it, like half are above that and half are below that, and you can only go to 1600, by definition, there's diminishing returns. Because what's going to happen is, a couple of years from now, you're going to drop to, oh God, 1410. And then families are going to look at the Princeton Review, U.S. News and World Report, and go, oh my God, Pomona's slipping, right? You're setting yourself up. You're not doing yourself any favors, let alone those folks. So you have to rethink the policies that you're prioritizing, the standards that you're prioritizing for hiring, for promotion, for tenure, for, I think about, obviously with employment, the Old Boys Network, the way that we do recruitment, the way that we do promotion within the corporate world. You just have to think about those things. And I think that means deciding what policies, practices, and procedures within our institutions fulfill a mission that is equity related and which of them detract. And unless we are prepared to get rid of the policies that detract from that and amplify the ones that contribute to it, then we're not serious about the work.
Yeah, as you were talking about the accounting firm, I was having thoughts of what would that website look like if it was viewed through a racial equity lens? What would they talk about? Maybe they would talk about the number of students that come from Latinx dominant institutions or historically Black institutions. Maybe they would talk about the training programs that facilitate matriculation up through the ranks of people who are not historically part of the E-suite power brokering units that they have. And that's a very different narrative.
Right.
And why do we not share that narrative? Because we've already identified who the people are that we want to speak to, and that they are people who look like us, and us being those who are white, predominantly male,
Right.
come from these particular institutions.
Right. I mean, you think about it in the college context. I always think it's really hilarious to see, or really disturbing, not very funny, to see so many schools beating each other up to move up one spot on the U.S. News, because we all know who's going to be in the top 10. Come on now. Stanford's always going to be up there. Harvard's, it doesn't matter what Harvard does. Harvard could take a nap for the next 5 years. They're going to be in the top 5 schools just on reputation alone. So you might move up a little bit within a range of 3 or 4, but for the most part, these things are pretty much established. So why are schools trying to beat each other up over those very elitist criteria? If I were a typical state institution or even a small liberal arts college, I would get together with my sort of similar institutions and I'd say, hey, let's create a different game. And the game that we're going to create is we're going to have measurements about how have we closed the graduation gaps between white students and Black and brown students? How have we helped, as you pointed out, people matriculate through here who otherwise might not be, and use that as not just a point of pride because it's about justice, but that also says something about the institution, right? That actually says, wait, I can reach everybody. You know, if all you can do is reach the people who anybody could reach because they already had advantages, why am I spending 50 grand a year for you to do that? I'm gonna give you $50,000 a year so that you can promote the people who were gonna make it any damn way. Like, why? You know, rather let me give you, hopefully not 50 grand, but let me give you some money so you can actually produce outcomes that are more equitable for everybody. That's who I want to be connected to. And I would think that if I'm a law firm, an accounting firm, whatever my company is, that ought to be bragging rights, both for the purpose of moral and ethical reasons, but also practical reasons. Look what we can do that these other folks don't even bother to do. To me, that again is interest convergence, that we could talk about it that way.
I want to shift for a couple of minutes to the policies part of the 3 Ps. Our protections of civil rights and human rights have been watered down. That the implementation, we've reduced the number of officers who are in the EOC, the amount of protections that people have, and that has been occurring precipitously since the Reagan administration. If you had the ear of a Biden-Harris administration, what would you recommend as far as shifting that trajectory on the way in which we are offering civil and human rights protections at the federal level?
Well, I mean, obviously we need to restaff those agencies and departments that have been devalued and understaffed and underfunded. But we also, look, we have to have bold policies for racial equity and justice. And my greatest fear for this administration is that because we've had 4 years of such chaos, that there will be a tendency to sort of nostalgize the normal that existed before 2016. And to some extent, Joe Biden has signaled as much. Like, there are times that Joe Biden seems very nostalgic for the collegial Senate that existed in the 1970s. Well, you know, that Senate, putting aside whether or not he should have been kibitzing with, you know, Senator Talmadge and these segregationists, whether or not he should have been doing that. The reality is that ain't the Senate that exists right now. And that's not the political culture that exists. So nostalgia, whether it's MAGA nostalgia, which is the right-wing version, or whether it's New Deal nostalgia, which is more of a liberal version, oh, let's just do Rooseveltian things and it'll be fine. or whether it's 1970s US Senate bipartisanship nostalgia. We need to move forward. That means we're not looking backward to old remedies and ways of doing things, even if we want to take advantage of those laws and those procedures to try to get some stuff done. We have to move quite a bit beyond that. That means, yes, for instance, we need to reinstate, let's say, some of the consent decrees that were in place with regard to police departments around the country, but that's not enough. We have to also start talking about the redirection of resources, particularly at the federal level down to the state and local level, towards different paradigms of public safety than policing. People get upset about the terminology of defunding the police, and I get it. It's not maybe the best slogan in the world, but the concept of depolicing, of moving priorities out of law enforcement to public safety and asking on that paradigm, because even the terminology, right, of public safety versus law enforcement, the language of law enforcement is by definition top down, and it's about control and enforcement. Public safety is about this larger range of options. How do we make the community safer? And the administration needs to be thinking about where federal funds are going to be placed for that purpose, right? And what that's going to look like. And it cannot look like kinder, gentler law enforcement. It cannot just look like body cams and some implicit bias training, which the research says does not work with people who are not heavily invested in getting better outcomes. We have to actually talk about structural policy changes that will remove the potential for certain types of abuse. That means demilitarization of law enforcement. That means all kinds of things that previous administrations, frankly, haven't done. And we have to lead with that, even if those things aren't all going to succeed. I realize that, when we talk about politics, there is a time and a place for compromise when you can't get something done. You have to have fallback positions. Obviously, everybody understands that. But you don't start with your fallback position. You don't go to someone on the other side of the aisle politically and start with like 50% of what it is that you want to get, because then when you compromise, you're going to have to come down to 25. You start by saying, here's what we want to get. We know we're not going to get all of it. Everybody understands that, but this is what we're trying to change: the discourse. We're trying to change the vision. And the notion of depolicing is not necessarily a policy. That's a vision. And then there will be a lot of different policies that move us in that direction in terms of redirecting resources. So I hope that the administration will have the vision to put forward those kinds of ideas. And then what we at the grassroots have to do is we have to do something that Barack Obama told us to do, but folks slept on it and acted like, oh, he'll take care of it. And that was never smart, to rely on the president. I don't care who the president is. I don't care if the president is somebody who agrees with you 100% on these things and is completely down for racial justice. I'm not going to rely on them. Barack Obama said, y'all have to make me do stuff. And frankly, we didn't enough. And then he didn't do it. And then we can get mad at him about it, but that's a little bit on us too, right? And so we have to be prepared to demand, even from our friends, ostensible friends, and maybe especially from our friends, the right outcomes. We know we're not going to get the right outcomes from our enemies and our adversaries, but we cannot assume that our friends will be there for us, because our friends are up against all kinds of other things that get into their head. And we have to stay clear so that they can stay clear.
I think that civic groups have a similar challenge in that they have to be made to do stuff. But one of the challenges that's a part of that is that in our city, in many others, those civic groups are predominantly made up of white folks. And many people who are part of those groups are interested in recruiting within the Black community. And this in some ways sounds like a weird question to ask you, but I'll ask. Do you have some thoughts of what could those folks be doing to make themselves, their agenda, more attractive to communities that do not find them to be attractive now, Black communities?
Well, I think that the part of that, first, I mean, the real answer is you have to talk to those communities and find out why they don't find your approach appealing, right? And it seems like such an obvious thing that I shouldn't have to say it, but if it were that obvious, we'd be doing it. If you want to know why folks don't trust you, you're going to have to ask, or you're going to have to figure out some other workaround to figure it out. Sometimes you find it out the hard way. Like I joke about when I was a senior in college, I did my senior honors thesis on civil rights organizing in Mississippi during Freedom Summer 1964. And I went into Mississippi, took a bunch of trips up to Mississippi on Greyhound bus, and got out and walked around different Black communities in Mississippi, thinking that folks would just talk to me about the movement. Like, I'm just going to show up. I'm 20, 21-year-old white dude showing up with a polo shirt on and some khakis and some docksiders or whatever, and knocking on black folks' doors. Hey, I'm here to talk to you about the movement. And I thought, oh man, they'll open up to me. Well, these people weren't going to open up to me. They didn't know who I was. They didn't know who I was related to. They didn't know whether I was the cousin or the nephew of the sheriff who's still the sheriff, been the damn sheriff for 30 years. They weren't going to open up to me. So my thesis was basically a project in futility because I didn't understand why the folks didn't trust me. The lesson was I learned. I had a hell of a good lesson to learn. It just wasn't the one I was hoping to learn, right? So if you want folks to want to be part of your community, to be part of your company, to be part of your nonprofit organization, you got to ask some fundamental questions about what's blocking that now. And sometimes, listen, sometimes it isn't about diversification of your institution. Sometimes it's about working together in solidarity for issues of common concern, even if you're not in the same organization. Here's an example. Many years ago, I was brought into Missouri to do a thing with the Episcopal Diocese there. And I don't know if it's one Episcopal diocese for the whole state or if there's an East and West, but I was in St. Louis. And so I'm talking to like these Episcopal church folks, and they're like, how do we diversify the pews on Sunday? They would quote Dr. King about, the most segregated hours, 9 to 12 or whatever on a Sunday or whatever. And I said, okay, but here's the thing. I said, y'all, it's an Anglican tradition, and there are plenty of Black Anglicans around the world, of course, but in this country, ECUSA, Episcopal Church, is a pretty, white institution overwhelmingly. Now, right now, of course, the bishop is not, but historically, that's how that's been. I said, so is your goal really to make Black folks who have their own church thing going come over and be part of your church? Or why don't y'all just talk to each other about, I don't know, what are some things y'all could be working on? Fair housing in your community, police violence in your community, failing schools in your community, healthcare access y'all could be working together on some stuff, forging relationships, and then maybe down the line that will lead to some integration of your space and some diversification. But y'all have got stuff you could be talking to each other about right now, building relationship and building trust before you start asking people to come be part of your thing, right? Because when I come to somebody and say, hey, come be part of my thing, their logical response is, well, why am I not already part of your thing? And why are you just coming to me now? Right. And the only way that we can really break through that is to build relationship. And that takes time and effort.
One final question for you. We have a lot of parents who are listening on and who will watch this a few days, few months, few years from now. What do you have suggestions to them of what they can be sharing with their children now so that they are developing into folks who value justice at the age of 10, 12, 15, and using that in order to create some of these policies, practices, and procedures and paradigm changes that you've identified? What can we say to those folks?
Yeah, I would say this, and this will be advice both for parents of color and also for white parents. I'll start with for parents of color. I'm loath to give too much advice because obviously, folks of color know how to raise their kids around these issues far better than I would. But I do have one recommendation. One of the things that I know I've talked to lots of Black parents about, and a lot of teachers about too, with regard to how to raise these issues in schools, is so often when we talk about race and racism in our society, the narrative is solely a narrative of oppression and victimhood. Right. And the problem is, if we're trying to talk to young children, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, about racism to prepare them for the world and get them ready to fight and to be part of the solution, if your whole narrative is one of oppression and victimhood, for a 7-year-old, that's really frightening. Right. For that Black 7-year-old, 6-year-old, 8-year-old, that can be very disempowering because they feel as an object of history, not a subject of history. So for Black parents, of course, it means, and so many Black parents already know this, but teachers of Black children, regardless of race, need to know this too. We need to craft narratives of resistance, not just narratives of oppression and victimhood, but narratives of resistance. In other words, when we start talking about segregation, start with the resistance to segregation. You start with the sit-ins. You start with those who fought back. We talk about enslavement. You don't start with the capture and the transporting of Black folks from Africa, you start with enslaved folks' rebellions. You start by placing agency in the oppressed and the marginalized, because that sends a message that I'm not just done to, I have the capacity to act. Then for white children and white parents, it's about identifying for your kids those examples in history, of which there are many, not nearly enough, but there are many white folks throughout history who have stood up and said no to systems of white supremacy and racism. The fact that we can't name most of them is unfortunate. And it's the result of a school system that didn't feel the need to teach us about them. And the ones that we can name, the white folks who did stand up, tend to be martyrs. So we can name John Brown, and we can name Viola Liuzzo, and we can name Goodman and Schwerner, and we might be able to name James Reeb, right? We can name a handful of folk, but they all got killed for doing the work. Well, how are you going to, mobilize a new generation of people around martyrdom? I don't want people rushing to the barricades to become martyrs. That's dangerous stuff. But what if white children learn that there were people like them, like their families, going back to the colonial period, that said no to this thing? Right, that actually said, hold on just a minute. There were folks that stood up against land indigenous removal from the land all throughout the Southeast, right here in Tennessee, where I am, and all throughout the country. There were white folks that stood up against enslavement. There were white folks that stood up against the Confederacy, whites in the South, not just in the North, but whites in the South. They had, West Virginia became a thing because the western part of Virginia was filled with folks that didn't want to break away to maintain slavery. Why don't we talk about that? Why don't we talk about white folks historically that said no? Well, if we did, we would have role models that we could connect to, but we don't do that. And so I think it's about telling tales of resistance by Black and brown folk and leadership, and telling tales of solidarity for white folk, so that we begin to see ourselves. For Black and brown children, that means seeing themselves in leadership roles, fighting for justice. And for white folks, that means seeing ourselves in solidarity roles side by side with Black and brown folks. So if you can't see that in history, you'll have a hard time seeing it in yourself. And so I think that's one place for parents to start.
I am deeply appreciative of this conversation from one debater to another. Thank you very much for hanging out with me and hanging out with the city that I love. And on behalf of the city, we truly believe that we are in a struggle in order to make our city anti-racist. And we fundamentally believe that that can't be done without the assistance of folks like yourself, Dr. Catherine Meeks, and Dr. Andra Gillespie, and Jane Elliott, who showed up here to have these conversations with us and to have an ongoing conversation, that these things will not change with one talk, with one discussion, with one person showing up, but it will change if we get together as a community and figure out what are the ways in which we can fundamentally adjust the policies, practices, procedures, and paradigms that's governing the way in which we operate. That the final thing that I would like to say is that Decatur is in the midst of a strategic plan, that we will have a community engagement session that is around these issues of social justice, equity, and racial diversity, and that will occur on January the 14th at 6 p.m. And we are very much interested in everyone who is here showing up to that meeting to add their voice to the conversation that we're having. Tim, you are awesome. And I am very thankful that you are now part of the Decatur family.
Appreciate you all so much. Thank you for having me.